Our scripture today is Mark 2, verses 9 to 13. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up to a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Peter did not know what to say. They were so frightened. And so I guess Peter talked. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead would mean. And they asked him, "Why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it was written about him." Will?
Thank you, Lois. It was an interesting choice this summer as we were reflecting on these holiday Mondays. There were a few other churches that were deciding that they weren't going to be open, and I thought, well, maybe we can coordinate something. And when we looked at volunteer options, it looked like, well, no, these holiday Sundays are especially hard to fill, so next Sunday there won't be a service here. And then we've all had an opportunity. We could catch up on some sleep, or we could visit other churches. And that's one of the things that I did. I visited another church that I've been following. I have a lot of respect for the pastor there. And it turns out this other pastor also took the week off. So I got to listen to a guest speaker, but that was fine. And as I was there, it was good. We connected with some other friends who were there, but there were things that I was watching for. And one of the things that I noticed was music. We all have different music styles and tastes that we appreciate. And one of the things that I've always loved about music at Trinity is that there's an effort to build on our knowledge of familiar songs while learning new ones as well. And in this church, all of the songs were new. And most of the people around me weren't familiar with those songs. And I got some wisdom a while ago that said, if you're leading worship, if you're leading singing, you should sing at least one song that a family can sing by memory around a hospital bed. And that last song that Lois picked for us, I think, is beautiful, perfect for that. So that's something that I was looking for that I didn't get. But the sermon came, and they had provided notepads and I wrote a half a page of notes. There was lots of good points that I could reflect on later. And I came home with that extra knowledge that I appreciated. But as I was talking to other people, taking notes wasn't a high priority for everybody else. And that makes sense. We don't all have to experience teaching that way. Not everybody wants to or needs to do that. And not every sermon presents something noteworthy or new. And sometimes we read a passage of Scripture and it comforts us, it empowers us, And we're looking for different things. We're not always looking for new knowledge. I usually am, but that's one of my personality traits that isn't universally shared, and I recognize that. We want different things from sermons. Some of us want a beautiful encounter. We want the preacher to paint a picture of God's majesty and love that inspires us. Some of us just want to have an encounter with power. We want to be convicted of our sin. We want to be empowered to go out into the world and do powerful things. Some of us do want to have our brains stimulated with new ideas. Some of us just want to hear reassurance that the values that we have continue to be worthwhile. So then there's kind of this spectrum, and we don't always know where we fit. And sometimes there's pressure to, well, we should experience it this way. These are the good Christians. They experience it in one particular way. And as I was thinking about this spectrum, now I remembered a time, this is going to sound a little bit strange, and my kids have maybe forgotten, so don't ask them to verify the details of this story. But this was a while ago. The kids were younger, and there was activity in the kitchen. I forget exactly what was happening. And something happened, some grease got spilled, and it connected with heat, and there was a fire in our kitchen. And there was screaming, there was running, there was confusion and chaos. I wasn't exactly in the kitchen in that moment, but I saw what happened. I had enough wherewithal and knowledge. I opened the fridge, I grabbed the box of baking soda, dumped a bunch in my hand, threw it on the fire. Fire was out. Everything's fine. To me, no big deal. To other adults watching, it would also have been no big deal. We understand that this is what the firefighters tell us to do. No big deal. But my kids hadn't heard the science lessons of what to do with a grease fire. And there was a sense of wonder in their eyes, which I've failed to replicate since then, probably. But in their eyes, and they were quite young, but they were convinced I had performed some sort of magic in that moment. Right? So there were two voices that seemed relevant in that moment, right? One voice says, just relax. It's just a kind of science. There are characteristics of the baking soda that work well with the grease, and it just neutralizes. That's all that happened. But there's another voice that says, no, just let them hold on to wonder a little bit longer. Not wonder at me, but wonder at the magic. Wonder at the divide between the chaos and confusion of the fire and the calm and the peace of the after the fire. Let's just sit in that wonder a little bit longer. Doesn't have to be for my benefit. Let's just sit in that wonder. And that's one of the exciting things of having kids around, is every now and then there's something that is entirely mundane to us adults, but gives them a sense of wonder. And we want to sit in that wonder as long as possible, because it's tough for us to get there ourselves. So then when we read the Bible, we want to experience that sense of wonder. And sometimes there's a feeling that if we think too hard, that kills that wonder. That if we overanalyze it, then it just becomes ideas, and there has to be some power, some magic in it. And when we do that, a lot of Bible stories really boil down to Jesus was really great, God is really great, and we should follow them. That's the end of the story. But sometimes something about the story can stimulate our mind and our sense of wonder. So, for example, the story of the woman who had a secret health problem, and she just touched Jesus and was healed instantly. Now, for many of us, probably especially the men, that's just the story of how great God is. But if something has happened in your life that you can identify with that woman, then your engagement with that story is deeper. Then you get deeper into the story. You get more out of it. We all connect with these different stories in very different ways. So sometimes we look at a story, okay, Jesus fed a whole bunch of people, they were hungry. That's good. We don't need to think about the old meanings of how many people were there. We don't need to kind of look at Greek roots and compare it to other stories. Isn't it just good enough that the people were fed? Yes, sometimes it is. But sometimes other people get more connections out of those little details. And sometimes it seems like the disciples never really get beyond that. Right? The disciples are really just engaging at that level that, wow, isn't it cool what Jesus can do? Okay, but guys, Jesus is trying to teach you some things here. So that's part of the struggle of these stories is, yeah, we want to sit in that sense of wonder, but there's more to learn. Jesus does want us to learn some things. Jesus doesn't want to just put on a show. Because there are people in the story who just want to see the show, but they're the Pharisees. They don't want to follow Jesus. They don't want to learn from him. They just want to see a show. And otherwise there's no value to it. So sometimes we put ourselves in the story and there's more meaning. Sometimes a tidbit of knowledge just makes the story come alive. Sometimes we just need a sense of power. So which one is this story that Lois read for us today? Which one is the case for you as we read that? So just to do some of the sort of the brain work, the detail building here. The question of who Jesus is already a recurring theme through the Gospel of Mark. But it seems like it's been ramping up a little bit. So there was a storm. Jesus calms the sea, and the disciples ask themselves, the disciples who have chosen to follow Jesus, the disciples who've learned a lot from Jesus over a long time, they see Jesus perform a miracle, and they're still saying, who is this guy? They're still asking themselves. And then Jesus heals people, but then Jesus says, okay, but don't tell anyone who I am. Don't tell anybody who healed you. Don't tell anybody what happened. Okay, but now, like, we're getting a sense of who you are, Jesus. Shouldn't we tell people? And then the Pharisees, they don't believe, and they want to see Jesus. Okay, prove it. Show us a sign. And then we're going to take your actions, we're going to filter it through all of our levels of knowledge and discernment, and then we will decide who you are. Jesus isn't interested in performing for them. And then just now, that was also in the previous chapter, in Mark chapter 8. And then the last story, maybe the last two stories, Jesus gathers his disciples and he says, okay, what are people saying? Who do people say that I am? And they gather, they explain their ideas. Some say John the Baptist. Some say Elijah or one of the prophets. And then Peter gives the right answer. He says, you are the Christ. And Jesus thanks him, compliments him, but again says, okay, but don't tell anybody who I am. That's part of this strange thing, because we feel like we're supposed to tell people, but why couldn't the disciples then? It doesn't leave us entirely clear. And then after Peter says, okay, you're the Messiah, and Jesus says, okay, let me tell you what it means to be the Messiah. The Son of Man, the human one, whatever translation you want to use, says, or the human one will suffer. I'm going to be arrested and tortured and killed. But I'll come back. But that's what it means to be the chosen one. That's what it means to be anointed. I've been anointed for a task. That's part of the task I've been anointed for. So there's this long conversation. The disciples seem to be gaining more and more information about who Jesus is. And then God intervenes. Jesus has been telling them. The people around them have been telling them. They've been figuring it out themselves. And now in this story, God himself steps into the story. Now, in this story, there's no explanation of how. It just says, suddenly Jesus was in radiant white clothes. Was he glowing through his clothes? Was it light from... We don't know. Doesn't matter. But Peter sees the situation. Here's Jesus, dazzling white. Moses, Elijah. It's this magical, powerful, transformational event. And Peter says, okay, well, I was right the last time. I was right about the Messiah thing. I'm going to say something now. So Peter steps forward and he says, Jesus, it's so good that we get to see this. It's so good that we're here, so we can build shrines for you. We can build monuments where people will gather to worship in this space because this moment is so powerful. Excuse me. But Peter is wrong this time. Peter speaks quickly, but Mark, the gospel writer, tells us right away. Well, Peter only said this because he was terrified. Right? Mark is saying, listen, Peter didn't get this one right. Because what happened was Peter saw his heroes. Right? Peter saw Jesus, his teacher, the guy that he thought was the Messiah, standing side by side with Peter's heroes of faith. Moses, the man who led God's people through the wilderness, the man who climbed Mount Sinai to get the law, the instructions from God. And Elijah, one of the great prophets of Israel's history. And Peter says, wow, my heroes are here. And Jesus, let's build 3 shrines. This is beautiful, so people can come to this space and worship each of you. So what part of that seems wrong? Why does Mark so quickly say, but Peter only said this because he was scared? Mark is telling us right away something about what Peter said was wrong. And some scholars say that Mark was mostly borrowing from Peter's account. So for Mark to speak ill of Peter must be significant. So what was wrong with this? Well, a little while ago I was online, kind of doing my thing with social media, trying to learn from and participate in conversations about Jesus and church and things like that. And there's a pastor that I know that I've connected with, and this pastor sort of sits a little bit in between the Anabaptist Mennonite world and the evangelical world. And sometimes it comes across in those social media posts that it's not clear which one he's more comfortable in. And lately it's been a little bit more on the evangelical side. And part of the limitation of social media is you don't always know the deeper meaning. You sometimes are missing some of the nuance, but that's kind of the sense that I've gotten, that he's rooted in the evangelical world and is a little bit suspicious of the Mennonite world, which is fine. That's his experience. So he was asking about which Mennonite beliefs give you meaning, which ones deepen your faith. And I felt like there was a lot of pressure to sort of justify myself and my faith tradition, to help him root himself a little bit better in our shared background. And I said, well, the centrality of Jesus is important to me. Having Jesus at the center, and this is one of the things that we in our churches have kind of figured out, that we do this a little bit differently. We elevate Jesus' words above the rest of the Bible. And some people, it turns out, including this pastor, don't see it that way. So then he responded to my statement about centering Jesus with a post that it was a little bit cryptic. He said, so rather than doing the work to harmonize things, you just elevate Jesus. Now, again, I don't know all of the deeper things that he meant, but it felt like a bit of a criticism. It felt like he was saying, yeah, sometimes it seems inconsistent, but that's the work you have to do to read it, to keep the Old Testament, the New Testament, to keep the law, the prophets, the epistles, and Jesus all on the same level. That's the work you have to do as a Christian, as a pastor. That's the work you have to do. And he said, if you're just focusing on Jesus, you're cutting out a whole bunch of other stuff. You're kind of a lazy leader then, was the sense that I got. Maybe he meant none of that. Maybe everything was fine, but that's kind of what I heard there. And so I was feeling a little bit inspired and a little bit more clear than I normally am. And so I responded and I said, but Jesus is the harmonization. All of the Old Testament points forward to Jesus. Everything that Paul and the later church leaders write is writing back about Jesus. All of them harmonize their words and thoughts into who Jesus is. So, I said Jesus is the harmonization. And we as Mennonites value harmonization, but more usually about music than theology. And then I did something that maybe some people would say I shouldn't do, but I used this story. And I took Peter's words, where he says, Rabbi, it's good that we are here. Let's make three shrines, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, and let's harmonize all of your voices. Because that's what Peter got wrong. That was Peter saying, isn't it great that Jesus has been elevated to the level of the law and the prophets? But Peter was wrong. Peter soon figured out he was wrong. Mark knew that Peter was wrong. God knew that Peter was wrong. Because God intervened. God spoke in that moment so that Peter, James, and John all heard it. And God said, this is my son. Listen to him. Elijah and Moses were still there. Right? Moses and Elijah were there. Part of the story, Jesus, or the voice of God could have said, these are my voices. These are my equally equipped, equally valuable voices that you should be listening to. No, God did not say that. God said, this is my son. There are lots of times where we have that push and pull. We want to follow Jesus, but we have all of these other good things that we feel are pulling us towards a different kind of holiness. Nothing in this story diminishes Moses or Elijah. Nothing in this story or any part of Jesus' ministry diminishes the impact of the law and the prophets on the people of Israel or on the church that would grow out of it. The law and the prophets are perfectly good, perfectly useful for training, equipping, educating, inspiring, all of the things that the Bible is supposed to do. But they are not equal with Jesus. So when we find an apparent inconsistency, which we sometimes do, we elevate Jesus. So the Old Testament is full of war stories, full of heroes of war, full of stories where it seems like God celebrates war. But in the New Testament, Jesus tells us to love our enemies. Jesus lays down his weapons when confronted by enemies. So, confronted with that choice, we choose Jesus. We elevate Jesus. There are stories in the Old Testament where the law, where the leaders, they say, these are the people you're supposed to exclude. The people who break these rules are out. The people who come from this part of the world are out. The people who live this way, love this way, they're out. And Jesus doesn't live that way. Jesus doesn't teach that way. If there's somebody the Old Testament says is unclean, Jesus loves them, receives them, celebrates them, draws them close to him. So if you want to know which one you're supposed to do, Jesus tells you. So I don't know what came of this encounter. It's funny, nobody really ever on social media writes back and says, "You've given me something new to think about. You've changed my mind." That never happens. So maybe he learned something, maybe not. Maybe he was inspired, maybe not. But there are stories where we can naturally identify with the events of the story. We all get hungry, then we can learn from, we can invest ourselves in the story of Jesus feeding others. We've experienced storms, then we can better understand where the disciples are coming from. So in this story, then we don't get to identify naturally, right? We don't get to say, "Oh, this is just like the time I was on a mountain and God spoke to us." We don't get to do that. But there are plenty of times where we have a list in our minds of things that are good that we have to sort of filter our Jesus experiences through. And sometimes we feel good that we can elevate Jesus to the level of these other things. But like Peter, we're doing it wrong, if that's what we do. So I wanted to share a couple of examples of some of those things that in the past I've been guilty of elevating to the level of Jesus, or even sometimes above, that I've learned about, that I've felt convicted about. So back to my pastor friend, there are times where we have voices where we feel led towards a more evangelical faith expression. And those are right and good voices most of the time. And there are times where we can root ourselves in our Mennonite and Anabaptist history and culture and all of those things, and those are often very good and valuable things to do. But sometimes those evangelical voices will fail us, especially as they kind of try to jockey to get power and influence in this world. They will fail us. And our Mennonite leaders and guides and teachers, they will fail us too, especially when they behave as institutions trying to demonstrate legitimacy and proper authority. They will fail us. And so when we're following Jesus, we don't have to filter it through, am I being evangelical enough? Am I honoring my Mennonite story enough? Those things don't matter. Follow Jesus. There are times in church life where we want to have everything organized and well presented. And it feels good to honor Jesus by having a well-structured church. But if people come here and they encounter Jesus, they're not really going to worry about levels of organization. And if they come here and we have a well-articulated set of bylaws on the website and all of our committee spots are full but people don't encounter Jesus, none of those other things will matter. There are times we surround ourselves by people that we greatly respect, who've demonstrated a seniority and loyalty within our community life, our family life. And then we will sometimes measure ourselves against them. And we'll want to be as righteous as them. And we'll want our faith expressions to look like them. But when we do that, we excuse a lot of their stuff. And we shame a lot of our stuff, which is good. So, following Jesus will sometimes mean that the people that we've elevated on spiritual pillars around us, that they have to fall away. Following Jesus is more important than earning respect and credibility from the established voices in your church and family and community. Following Jesus isn't always easy. Sometimes it invites judgment from others. I was attending church long before I came here, and every church I've ever visited, including the one that I did on the August holiday weekend, I have judged the sermon. I have judged the pastor preaching it, and I have judged the usher that led me to my seat. This is the way that our human brains work. I'm not proud of that, but that's the way that our brains work. So, as pastor, I have incurred and lived with judgment from people in the pews like you. I invite that by standing here. So I could say, well, I want to elevate, I want to experience God in a way that invites the least judgment from other people. That has never been beneficial. If you're following Jesus, you will be judged by others, including, and sometimes especially, other people who are following Jesus. And a lot of times, that's fine. I think participating in church community life means inviting the judgment of others. And sometimes, in proper situations with good boundaries, good relationships, that judgment is communicated. And somebody says, hey, listen, I think what you're doing is unhealthy for you, for your relationships, whatever. But that's not the end of the story. That's a conversation. That's an invitation to community. That's an invitation to deeper learning. Both people can learn from that if it's done well and sensitively and lovingly. Judgment is a part of our reality. But we won't get anywhere trying to diminish the judgment, trying to appease the judgment of everybody around us. I have a few minutes left, and I just wanted to wrap up. I hope that this is an encouragement for you. I hope that following Jesus is something that frees you from the shackles of community life, of church life, of judgment of others. I'm not wanting to elevate the people who judge better than others. But it's not always easy to know what to do when we're following Jesus. And in that difficulty, we should be giving grace to others. I have experienced a lot of grace in my time as pastor here. I've walked some difficult roads, and I have walked that road with many of you at my side. And I want to communicate my thanks for that now. There were things I couldn't have done by myself. There were trials I couldn't have faced on my own. You were with me. God was with me. God was with all of us. So my time as pastor has come to an end. And it's been an incredibly humbling journey, sometimes more fun than others. And I've learned a lot from you. I hope I've been able to teach and inspire and lead in some ways. But I want to reassure you that I have been taught, that I have been inspired, and I have been led by you in good ways. And so, as Lois said, we will be continuing to attend in ways that are appropriate. I leaned over and I asked Robin before, are you still going to want to hang out with me if you have to sit at the back instead of the front? And she reassured me that yes, that was the case. So I will do my best to support and and be a cheerleader for the leadership of this congregation, whatever that looks like. So again, I want to say thank you for walking with me. Thank you for inviting me into your journeys, your family moments and events. And I hope that in various ways that I have earned the ability to do that. So thank you, and God bless you. Amen.
Thank you, Will. The last sermon you are preaching here for a long time was, I think, well said. Listen to Jesus. Elevate Jesus. That was an excellent message. Thank you. And I want to also say that I really appreciate your final words about how you have been led by us as you have also led us. Thank you very, very much for that.